Hello everyone, in this video I'll cover the circulation, functions and applied aspects of cerebrospinal fluid. Circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, it is formed in the lateral ventricles. Cerebrospinal fluid is formed in the lateral ventricles, and from the lateral ventricles via the foramen of Monro, cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricles via foramen of Monro, it enters the third ventricle. Cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricle via the foramen of Monro enters the third ventricle, and from the third ventricle it enters into the fourth ventricle via aqueduct of Sylvius. And from the fourth ventricle via foramen of Magendie and foramen of Luschka, it enters the subarachnoid space. But from the fourth ventricle, there is always a flow of cerebrospinal fluid into the central canal of spinal cord. There is always a flow of fluid in the central canal of spinal cord, which is a continuous flow. Otherwise, it flows into the subarachnoid space, and from the subarachnoid space, it moves upwards towards the cerebral hemisphere and downwards towards the spinal cord. From the subarachnoid space, it enters downwards towards the spinal cord and upwards towards the cerebral hemisphere. That is, in the subarachnoid space, 80% it enters the dural sinuses. 80% enters the dural sinuses. It enters the dural sinuses through arachnoid villi. And another 20% enters the spinal veins. From the fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid via the foramen of Magendie and foramen of Luschka enters the subarachnoid space. From the subarachnoid space, the cerebrospinal fluid will move upwards towards the cerebral hemisphere. It will move upward towards the cerebral hemisphere, and downward it will go through a spinal cord. That is, from the fourth ventricle, there is always a continuous flow of the cerebrospinal fluid into the central canal. Otherwise, also from the subarachnoid space, there is a flow of the cerebrospinal fluid downwards towards the spinal cord and upward towards the cerebral hemisphere, out of which 80% enters the dural sinuses via the arachnoid villi, and another 20% enters the spinal veins, and it also enters the perivascular spaces from the spinal veins through the diffusion process. Cerebrospinal fluid functions. It takes place of lymph. Cerebrospinal fluid takes place of lymph in the brain because there is no lymphatic system for the brain. It provides an optimal chemical environment for the optimal activity of neurons. It is useful for the diagnosis of various disorders of the brain. Very useful for diagnosis of various brain disorders. We test the cerebrospinal fluid. It protects the brain from injuries. The cerebrospinal fluid protects from injuries. That is, it acts as a fluid buffer. The cerebrospinal fluid acts as a fluid buffer. It is a shock absorber. It protects the brain by that way. The cerebrospinal fluid, it helps in maintaining a constant internal volume of cranium. It helps in maintaining the constant internal volume of cranium. Cerebrospinal fluid provides chemical environment. It's useful for diagnosis of brain disorders, protects from injuries, and helps in maintaining the constant internal environment of cranium. Cerebrospinal fluid, it also provides nutrition to nerve cells. Lastly, cerebrospinal fluid, the continuous formation and draining, it helps in preventing the accumulation of various metabolic products. There is continuous formation and draining of CSF, and this continuous formation and draining prevents accumulation of certain metabolic products in the brain. There is a continuous formation and draining, so that prevents the accumulation of certain metabolic products in the brain. Also, cerebrospinal fluid, it helps in controlling the control of respiration. that is in the medullary chemoreceptors. This carbon dioxide is acting, and it will act by altering the this carbon dioxide. It acts on the chemoreceptors. It acts on the chemoreceptors by altering the pH of cerebrospinal fluid, pH of CSF. It is alters the carbon dioxide acts on the chemoreceptor by altering the pH of cerebrospinal fluid and the brain's extracellular fluid. And this change in pH, it helps in this acclimatization in high altitude by combating the respiratory alkalosis. Control of respiration, that is, there is carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide acts on this chemoreceptor by altering the pH of cerebrospinal fluid and the brain extracellular fluid, and this change in the pH is the one which helps in the acclimatization in the high altitudes and in respiratory alkalosis. Hydrocephalus, it refers to the pathological accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in cranium. Hydrocephalus, it refers to the pathological accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the cranium. Pathological, that is due to some defect, that is due to decreased absorption. This decreased absorption could be due to the blockage in the dural sinuses, or it could also be due to increased formation. Hydrocephalus, it refers to the pathological accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the cranium, which could be due to decreased absorption, this is actually because of the blockage or something in the dural sinuses, or due to the increased formation. There are two types of hydrocephalus. Two types are there: internal and external. Two types of hydrocephalus are internal and external hydrocephalus. Internal hydrocephalus, this is actually the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. It's in the ventricular system. In the ventricular system, there is accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. Ventricular system, accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. Ventricular system, that is the foramen of Monro or the cerebral aqueduct. That's the internal hydrocephalus. External hydrocephalus, that is cerebrospinal fluid. It is accumulated in the subarachnoid space. Cerebrospinal fluid is accumulated in the subarachnoid space. That is due to the blockage outside ventricular system. This hydrocephalus, as external hydrocephalus, is due to the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space, that is outside the ventricular system. This could be due to the inflammation of meninges, or thrombosis in dural sinuses. Internal and external hydrocephalus. The internal hydrocephalus is the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricular system. External hydrocephalus is the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space, that is outside the ventricular system, due to inflammation of meninges or thrombosis in dural sinuses. Thank you guys.